This is an extract from the Leader Coronavirus Daily podcast by the Evening Standard and hosted by me, David Marsland. To hear the whole thing, search for it on your podcast provider.
The crucial thing is to make sure that we're ready to crack down on local flare-ups. And that's why, we've got the whack-a-mole strategy.
Prime Minister Boris Johnson told Times Radio the country is ready for local flare-ups of coronavirus, insisting the UK can bounce forward as he pushes for the economy to reopen. The city of Leicester could be the first to experience this new strategy, as a further 866 recorded cases means it potentially faces 2 more weeks of lockdown. But what would happen if there was another spike in the capital? Alex Thomas from the Institute of Government joins me now. Alex, if London sees a surge of COVID-19 cases, will we be looking at a citywide or borough-by-borough shutdown?
It could mean a sort of blanket return to the sort of lockdown that we were all experiencing at the end of March and in April, if it was really serious. But I think more likely is that the government will decide to apply a more partial lockdown and focus on requiring certain businesses not to open, certain events not to happen. So almost a sort of a partial rollback of some of the changes that we've seen in the last few weeks and that we're expecting to see next week. So I think it's more likely to be a partial thing than a kind of complete return to lockdown. But obviously that depends on the seriousness of the disease progression and the situation.
Can the government actually do it? Logistically, legally, how will lockdowns work?
The government and the local authorities are going to need to have to manage this, because the moment you get into borough by borough or more kind of partial lockdowns, it gets incredibly complicated. I think there are 3 things really the government needs to make sure it's got in place in order to manage all of these things. The first is that it's got the right kind of legal powers there at the moment, and we're not sure yet that the legal powers exist for either the national government or local authorities or the London Mayor in order to enforce some of these, in order to have the powers to bring these lockdowns in. The other thing that they need is the data and the information, so they need to be able to assess where the disease is and what's going on and use that to take decisions. Then the third thing, and I think this is the really, really, really difficult thing, is they need the enforcement powers and tools in order to make that happen. It's just not going to be plausible to have the police and other authorities enforcing loads of incredibly complicated and specific rules. It's going to have to be kind of pragmatic and practical, and it's going to have the consent of the people who are being asked to restrict themselves. One of the things that's really unclear in all of this is whether ministers should be taking that decision or whether it should be local leaders. I mean, we've heard over the last few days the mayor of Leicester and also obviously Sadiq Khan in London are complaining that they're not being let into these conversations enough. And actually, they're the civic leaders who've been elected by their people, and they would say they should be the people who have the power to take these sorts of decisions.
And at the start, the government was quite good at communicating what a lockdown meant and everyone knew what they had to do. But now the boundaries around this seem a little bit more vague, and we see that with people flouting the rules more and more. If there's another lockdown, would this just add to the confusion, especially if it was borough by borough?
So I think what the government's likely to say is it wants people to kind of take personal responsibility and understand the risk. I think they're going to try as far as possible to sort of avoid these very, very specific, very prescriptive rules, and to try and people to kind of use their common sense, particularly when you get to kind of local areas or borough by borough restrictions. But what they are going to need to do is to inform people and say, actually, the risk is particularly high in your area, and therefore, unfortunately, we're going to have to ask you to stay at home, or we're not going to allow the pubs to open in your area. And the other thing, of course, about London is everybody moves around all the time. As we all know, the borough restrictions are they're important for administrative reasons, but they don't affect people's everyday lives. As they go about their work and social lives. So it's going to be a real challenge to enforce anything like a kind of borough or sort of sub-regional approach.
Search for the Leader Coronavirus Daily on any podcast provider to hear more from the podcast.